With most people in the country right now focusing their attention on the results of the midterm elections, and rightfully so, well, there's a quote I'd like to point out. I forgot exactly where I read it, but here was the basic gist. Quote, "If we elect Democrats, we'll be a socialist country in 10 years. But if we elect Republicans, it'll probably take 15 years. Now, that was, of course, a joke. However, there is some truth to it, because it seems like regardless of which party is in power, our country appears to be slowly, incrementally stripping citizens of their basic fundamental rights. Now, you might say, hold on, Roman, what exactly are you even talking about? We have rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights, which is part of the U.S. Constitution, the highest law of the land. And I would say that's true. However, over the past 230 odd years, those rights have slowly been eroded away. Now, on this program, we've already spoken of many different examples. The right to freedom of speech, for example, is being attacked by what appears to be blatant collusion between social media companies and the government. The right to keep and bear arms is treated like a privilege in some places, a privilege that can be taken away on a dime. But today, in today's episode, I'd like to focus on a different right that's being encroached upon, a right that you and me, the people in general, typically take for granted, the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. Because you see, unbeknownst to most people, the US government has been, for years now, using a piece of technology called a Stingray device to collect massive amounts of data on US citizens without any search warrants. And if you think that's bad, well, it's likely going to get worse, because just last month, Joe Biden, very quietly, without much fanfare and without almost any media reporting on it, he revoked part of something called the Presidential Policy Directive number 28, making it even easier for the government to spy on American citizens. However, let me back up for a moment and set the stage for you properly here in order to make sense of all these different developments. If you're like most people, then you likely have your phone next to you all day long. In fact, you might be watching this video on your phone right now. But while a cell phone provides many conveniences, it's also, at the same time, essentially a tracking device. As an example of what I mean by that, if you happen to subscribe to, let's say, AT&T, well, you will not receive any phone calls or any text messages unless AT&T can locate your phone, which is a process that's accomplished, at least in part, by the use of cell phone towers. Because the network, meaning AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, and all the rest of them, they are always checking to see which cell phone tower their subscribers are closest to. And if, let's say, you happen to be moving around and your cell phone is no longer within the reach of the last tower that it previously connected to, then the search radius expands outward towards other cell phone towers within that same tracking area. Essentially, what this means in practice is that your phone is always looking to find the nearest cell phone tower, while at the same time, the nearest cell phone tower is always looking to find your phone. That's a bit of an oversimplified way of explaining it, but that's generally how it works. However, this is where things, you can say, get a little tricky, because this right here is what's known as a cell site simulator. Specifically, this is a very popular model of this device with the brand name Stingray. It's the brand that's most widely used by US intelligence agencies. And what the Stingray does is that it masquerades itself as a cell phone tower. Essentially, the Stingray exploits the technical process by which a phone communicates with a tower by pretending to be a tower. The way that it works is that the moment a Stingray device is deployed into a given area, it begins acting as a tower, and it begins transmitting a radio signal that's slightly more powerful than the actual cell phone tower within the area. The result is that the cell phones within the range of the Stingray, they drop their connections to the legitimate cell phone towers, and instead, the cell phones connect themselves to the Stingray device. And once the cell phones are connected to the Stingray, multiple consequences start taking effect one after the other. First of all, the cell phones lose their ability to either send or to receive phone calls, text messages, or any other forms of communication. That's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is that the person who's using the Stingray device, they can then gain access to a treasure trove of data, including your phone number, the details of who you've been calling and who you've been texting, the details of who's been calling you and who's been texting you, what websites you've been visiting, which cell phone towers you've recently pinged, meaning where you've been traveling to recently, and then they can even drain your phone's battery by overloading it with requests for signal. And furthermore, these Stingrays, they don't have to be stationary. In fact, the way that the US government uses them is very often by mounting them into a vehicle, a low-flying airplane or a drone, or even in a person's backpack. They're extremely versatile. And also, they're extremely accurate. So accurate, in fact, that they are capable of finding a particular cell phone within a high-rise apartment building down to the exact room number that the phone is located in. And so if you've ever wanted a visual representation of Big Brother government, well, a drone that's flying around the sky with a Stingray device attached to it, scanning the area for your whereabouts, well, that pretty much fits the bill. Now, initially, when these devices were first created, they were made with military purposes in mind. Because of their ability to block incoming cell phone signals, they were a useful deterrent against homemade bombs that were activated by cell phones. They would block the cell signals and prevent the bombs from being able to explode. However, like everything else in the government that has to do with fighting terrorism, the use of this device has morphed into something well beyond what it was initially meant to do. And you fast forward 20 years, and these Stingray devices are found all throughout the government. In fact, according to a congressional report that was released back in the year 2016, the Justice Department, as well as the Department of Homeland Security, they have together spent at least $95 million on more than 430 Stingrays just between the years of 2010 and 2014. Think about that. In just 4 years, just these two departments have purchased at least 430 Stingrays. But it's of course not just the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security. According to an investigation that was conducted by the ACLU, there are at least 73 agencies across 25 different states that use Stingrays to spy on unsuspecting American citizens. Although it's worth mentioning that in that same report, they also admitted that the real number of agencies which use Stingrays is likely much higher, given the fact that the government is extremely secretive about their use and extremely reluctant to even acknowledge that they're being purchased. Regardless, though, here are a few of the agencies at the federal level that own Stingray devices. You have the FBI, the DEA, the U.S. Marshal Service, you have even the IRS, the NSA, among many other agencies. And that's, again, all at just the federal level. At the different local levels, the different municipalities have likewise gotten into the action as well. That's because the Department of Homeland Security, they allow local law enforcement agencies, like your local state and county police departments, to buy Stingray devices using terrorism prevention grants. Meaning, local municipalities receive anti-terrorism grants that they are allowed to use to purchase Stingrays. And with the current campaign to combat domestic terrorism and the big push to label anyone, including concerned parents, as domestic terrorists, well, it really makes you wonder what these Stingrays are really being used for. Now, at this point, you are very likely thinking to yourself, isn't this illegal? Can the police really just eavesdrop on my cell phone like this without a warrant and without even any probable cause? Well, the answer appears to depend on who you ask. Because for their part, the US government has been making the argument that since you are transmitting your personal information using a third party, in this case the phone company, you do not have a reasonable expectation of privacy. They view it similar to a public trash can. If you take the chewing gum out of your mouth and throw it into a trash can, well, the police can then take that gum out of the trash and do a DNA test on it, because there is no reasonable expectation of privacy in a public trash can. Similarly, they are saying that since you are sending your information into the public sphere through your cell phone plan, you likewise don't have the right to privacy over that information once it's sent out. And what's surprising about this, at least it was surprising to me, is that the government does appear to have precedents to make that argument. That's because back in the year 1979, there was a U.S. Supreme Court case called Smith versus Maryland. And in that case, a man by the name of Michael Lee Smith, he was captured by the authorities after the police subpoenaed his records from the phone company, meaning that the police were able to capture Mr. Smith partly because they forced the phone company to reveal to them who he was calling. And so, Mr. Michael Smith filed a lawsuit against the state of Maryland, arguing that those records were private and that this was a Fourth Amendment violation. However, again, this was back in the year 1979, the Supreme Court ruled against him. The court determined that a person waives their constitutional right to privacy when they tell the phone company which phone number they wish to be connected to. Meaning that since Mr. Smith should have expected the phone company to keep a record of his calls, he effectively waived his right to privacy. And that's exactly the argument that the government continues to use today. That because you use a cell phone, which you know connects to the local cell phone tower in your area, you're automatically, effectively signing away your right to privacy and ergo your Fourth Amendment protections. That's one of their arguments. The other argument that the government uses to push the idea that they don't need either probable cause or a search warrant to use Stingrays is because they claim that Stingrays don't collect the actual content of either your phone calls or your text messages, but instead they only capture some of the surface level data, like who it is you're calling and when. And therefore, they claim that it's okay because they're not really violating your privacy in that way. Although, to be frank, that particular argument is not really convincing, or at the very least, it's only partially true, because the newer versions of the Stingray device, they appear to actually be able to collect the actual content of your phone calls, your text messages, and the websites that you visit. And so the government's argument here is not really that convincing, at least to me. But regardless of all the different technicalities, let's step out of the weeds for a moment and take a quick moment to refresh our memory about what the Fourth Amendment actually says. Here it is, quote, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." And so, because of the plain and unambiguous language of this right, civil rights groups have made the argument that these stingray devices, when used by the government, violate the Fourth Amendment. And surprisingly, the group fighting back strongest against all of this is the ACLU. They have been making the argument for years now that capturing the private phone data from American citizens, especially from phones which are often used in the privacy of a person's home, does in fact constitute the definition of a search as described in the Fourth Amendment. And according to them, capturing this data through the warrantless use of stingrays clearly does not meet the standard of, quote, "probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." Furthermore, besides violating just the Fourth Amendment, the ACLU has also argued that the use of these stingray devices is illegal because it interferes with communication signals, which is something that's actually prohibited under the Federal Communications Act. And of course, the ACLU further pointed out that it's not only the government and the police that can use this technology. Here's, for instance, what Mr. Christopher Sogian, the chief technologist at the ACLU, said on this particular matter. Quote, "Our government is sitting on a security flaw that impacts every phone in the country. If we don't talk about stingray-style tools and the flaws that they exploit, we can't defend ourselves against foreign governments and criminals using this equipment too." Meaning that since the government wants to continue using these devices, well, there is no political will to properly regulate them, making it possible for criminals to be able to use them as well. But again, to fight back against this particular problem, the ACLU appears to really be doing the heavy lifting here. In fact, they conducted their own investigation into the use of stingrays and used that investigation to create a document. You can see it up on screen for yourself, which lists a number of recommendations for the federal government. And included in this document is a slew of serious accusations against the federal government in the way that they've been using stingrays up until now. As just one example, the ACLU wrote in this investigation report that on the rare occasions when the police actually went to seek proper authorization to use the stingray device, meaning when they actually went to a judge to get a search warrant, they have, on numerous occasions, withheld information from the judges who issue warrants about the full scope and capabilities of the device, including what it collects, as well as the real number of innocent people who are likely to be impacted in the dragnet. And so, in these cases, a judge might issue a warrant, he might sign the search warrant, thinking that this device will target maybe just one or two cell phones and collect just a little bit of data, not knowing that in actuality, the cell phones in a large area will be affected with a slew of information being collected from all of them. What this means in practice is that judges across the country are potentially authorizing the use of a technology that they know nothing about. Furthermore, this investigation answered a question that I've been wondering for quite a while now, which is, if these devices are so ubiquitous, if they are used quite literally all over the entire country, why don't we know more about them? Why aren't more people aware of their existence? And the answer appears to be that the federal government has gone out of its way to ensure that they remain secret. As an example of what I mean by that, this ACLU investigation found that on several occasions, the federal government actually forced states, as well as forced different localities, to sign non-disclosure agreements prohibiting them from releasing any information about these stingray devices, even in a court of law, which is quite frankly an almost unprecedented step in terms of both secrecy as well as surveillance here domestically in the United States. And if you'd like to see a few examples of what these non-disclosure agreements actually look like, I'll throw a few links down into the description box below so you can check them out for yourself. But they are pretty surprising. They're the type of non-disclosure agreements you would expect from a kind of hush-hush investigation or a corporate merger, not from a police department that's using this to dragnet the cell phone information of American citizens on a huge scale. Furthermore, besides just signing these non-disclosure agreements, there is a lot of evidence presented within this document that the federal government wanted these stingrays to remain secret, so much so that they would actually drop cases altogether when it looked like the details of their use was about to be brought to the attention of a court. As just one example of that, there was the case of a woman in St. Charles, Missouri, who pled guilty to being a getaway driver in several different robberies. However, this woman, she found out that the police had actually used a stingray device against her, and she changed her plea from guilty to not guilty. She wanted to fight the charge in court. But wouldn't you believe it? Instead of pursuing the case, like you would assume they would, the local prosecutors went ahead and dropped it. Think about that for a moment. They actually dropped the case altogether, letting the woman walk free instead of having a police officer be questioned about whether or not a Stingray device was used. There was another great example within this document that came out of Florida, where the ACLU actually set up a meeting with a local police office in Sarasota in order to review the documents pertaining to a case which involved police officers allegedly using a Stingray device. But wouldn't you know it, at the last minute, right before the meeting between the police and the ACLU was going to take place, the U.S. Marshals swooped in, they grabbed all the documents, claimed that all the documents belonged to the federal government, and they told the local police office that they had no right to release them. That's how secretive the federal government wants to keep these things. And that is why very likely you have never heard of them. And so now that we've thoroughly explained the problem, the next logical question is, what's the solution? And that isn't even remotely clear. Because you see, after the ACLU put together their list of recommendations for the government, there were two attempts to make some changes. The first attempt came in 2017 with a bill called H.R. 1061. Among other things, this bill would have imposed fines as well as prison time for anyone who was caught using a Stingray device without proper authorization. However, that was in 2017, and 5 years later, this bill is still stuck in the Subcommittee on Homeland Security, and it looks like it's going nowhere. The second attempt to rein all this in took place last year, in 2021. That was when a different piece of legislation, actually it was a bipartisan piece of legislation called the Cell Site Simulator Warrant Act, was introduced to both the House as well as the Senate. The purpose of that bill was to create a clear legal standard for the use of Stingray devices by government agencies. Senator Ron Wyden, who's a Democrat from Oregon, he sponsored the bill in the Senate, and he had this to say about it, quote, "Cell site simulators have existed in a kind of legal no man's land for far too long. Our bipartisan bill ends the secrecy and uncertainty around Stingrays and other cell site simulators and replaces it with clear, transparent rules for when the government can use these invasive surveillance devices. The Cell Site Simulator Warrant Act gives law enforcement the tools it needs to investigate crimes while ensuring that Americans' rights are fully protected." However, just like the previous attempt, the House and Senate versions of this new bill are now both in legislative limbo, being stuck in their respective subcommittees where, very likely, they will remain for the foreseeable future. Now, on the flip side, I should mention that after facing intense pressure, the Department of Justice actually did ultimately come out and they released some guidelines of their own regarding the use of Stingray devices. Those guidelines, which you can see up on screen for yourself, which now requires federal law enforcement agencies to obtain a warrant supported by probable cause in order to use these devices. And so you might say, wow, that's great. The problem is solved and our Fourth Amendment right is once again secured. But that's not the case. Because within those Department of Justice guidelines, they have a subsection which is called, quote, "exceptional circumstances where the law does not require a warrant," which is a beautiful sounding subsection, and it's vague enough to mean almost anything. What are these exceptional circumstances that don't require a warrant? Well, your guess is as good as anyone's. Furthermore, these guidelines as a whole from the Department of Justice, they, for one, only apply to criminal investigations. And so if a federal agency is using Stingray devices for national security purposes, well, they can still do so without a problem. And then second of all, these federal guidelines only apply to federal agencies, meaning they have no bearing on how Stingrays are used by the different state and local law enforcement offices who have been using them for years. And so that's the reality of the situation, where you have the Department of Justice looking like they're addressing the issue, even though, as a practical matter, they really aren't. Furthermore, if you think all this is bad enough, well, it might get even worse. That's because just last month, Joe Biden, very, very quietly, without much fanfare or without much media scrutiny, he revoked part of Presidential Policy Directive number 28, making it even easier for the government to spy on American citizens. Specifically, you can see Joe Biden's executive order up on screen for yourself, and here's what it says in relevant part, quote, "Presidential Policy Directive number 28 is hereby revoked, except for sections 3 and 6 of that directive and the classified annex to that directive, which remain in effect." Now, you're probably wondering what exactly is Presidential Policy Directive number 28. It's a very long name and very few people have actually heard of it before. Well, it was put in place back in 2014 by Barack Obama, and it placed safeguards on the personal information that was collected by the federal government, and it placed limitations on the federal government's use of signals intelligence to spy on American citizens, with signals intelligence being things like monitoring phone calls, text messages, emails, and general internet browsing data. Essentially, it restricted the government from arbitrarily spying on American citizens. If the government were to spy on U.S. citizens, they were required to apply through the courts for their permission. At its core, Policy Directive 28 was a way to, at least at a bare minimum, keep the government, at least you can say, somewhat accountable while it spied on us. And yet, even this veneer of accountability was just revoked. Let me give you a few examples of the part of the directive that Joe Biden just gutted. This was from the original Directive number 28, which was just revoked, again, last month by Joe Biden. Quote, "The United States shall not collect signals intelligence for the purpose of suppressing or burdening criticism or dissent, or for disadvantaging persons based on their ethnicity, race, gender, sexual orientation, or religion. Signals intelligence shall be collected exclusively where there is a foreign intelligence or counterintelligence purpose to support national and departmental missions and not for any other purposes." Now, in terms of why they did this, why Joe Biden's administration revoked these sections, well, it's not exactly clear. The Biden administration has actually offered very little explanation as to why this particular directive from Barack Obama was revoked. However, in the current political climate, where again, concerned parents who speak up at their school board meetings can now reasonably be classified as domestic terrorists, well, many people are concerned that the state apparatus might soon turn on them even more so than they already have. Regardless, though, I personally do not get into speculation. If you'd like to read the White House memo for yourself, and you can make up your own mind as to what it's all about, I'll throw that memo as well as all my research down into the description box below this video so you can go deeper into this story if you so choose. And also, I would like to give a big shout out to our fantastic researcher, Mr. Eric Schumacher, who helped pull together and make sense of all the data in today's episode. Until next time, stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.